This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Dr. Karen Young, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where she leads the Economics and Energy Initiative. She's also a senior research scholar at the Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy. Dr. Young joins us today for a discussion on the economic implications of the Israeli-Iranian conflict. Stay with us as we speak with Dr. Karen Young. Karen, welcome, and thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you. Really glad to be with you.
It's quite remarkable, it seems to me, that everyone begins to assume when there's Mideast conflict that it will be accompanied by a rise in energy prices. But that doesn't seem to have happened again. It hasn't happened lately, and it doesn't seem really to have happened recently when you think of all the big geopolitical spikes in recent months. Do I have that right, or talk to us about that?
Yeah, I mean, there has been this, we could see it as a bit of a decoupling between regional conflict and oil price risk. It's certainly very evident since October 7th, 2023, but maybe we can predate it back probably to maybe even 2016, because it has to do with supply. And one of the core reasons is that we have this abundance since the shale revolution of non-OPEC supply, so oil that's not coming from OPEC or from the Middle East, particularly from the United States, from Canada, but also the Western Hemisphere in general. So that's created this cushion, you could say. Oil markets are also, really comfortable in terms of where demand is right now. That has a lot to do with what's happening in Asia, with sort of continued tensions about the US-China relationship and where our kind of trade relationships and tariffs go. And then the third reason, which I think is maybe the most important, is that we're getting a lot more efficient in the way that we use oil and the way that we depend on oil in our global economy, but particularly the way we depend on it for GDP growth. So it used to be in the 1970s, 80s, that to increase basically 1% of GDP growth, especially in the rich world, it was like correlated to, a barrel of oil, right? So now, in sort of comparative terms, we need maybe half of that barrel, right, in terms of global supply. So, we're just getting more energy efficient and less dependent on oil as part of our energy mix, particularly in advanced economies. So that's kind of good news. And just, as a takeaway, what also is happening in emerging market economies, but particularly the Chinese economy, China right now, I think this month, for the first time, is generating about 25% of their electricity mix from renewable sources. So, a lot of where we think about where oil demand is coming from has been changing as we, kind of build out renewable capacity. China still uses a lot of dirty things, uses a lot of coal, but they're more and more relying on what they produce at home. So not having to import as much oil and renewable sources. So, those are some of the trend lines that even as our energy demand globally increases, and we still are, certainly seeing a rise in emissions, the way that we use oil has changed a lot. So what does that mean in terms of Middle East risk? It means that people who are in the market and oil traders see that things are well supplied, that we've got alternative sources geographically, and that the economy, the global economy itself, is less dependent, less sensitive to this commodity. But then they can price things a little more at the minute, right? And so you see these spikes and you see sort of an analysis in which it's until there is a direct attack on either the transit point in the Strait of Hormuz or an actual refining facility, or a production facility, the prices aren't going to move that much. And even if they do move, like we saw when we first had kinetic attacks between Israel and Iran, and then again in the last week, they settle very, very quickly. So the remarkable thing that happened is we went to 80 and then mid 60s in 24 hours. That's pretty intense.
Pretty intense. So let me ask about China, and then I'll work backwards to the Middle East. 25% is made up of China's consumption is made up of renewables. That's really high.
Of their electricity generation mix.
Of electricity generation mix. Got it. Are they also taking on less oil and gas because their economy is in decline? Is that a factor as well?
So China, continues to import a lot of oil, and they have been beneficiaries of of oil that has been coming out of Iran and from Russia at cheaper prices. And they've taken advantage of these, what we call the dark fleets of illegal oil, sanctioned oil. And a lot of that has been going to what they call the teapot refineries or independent refineries in China that then use it, for different purposes. China also has been taking advantage of, the last 2 years and even since 2022 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine to stockpile oil. So right now, as we in the United States sold off a lot of our strategic petroleum reserve, China did the opposite. So they were buying oil at a discount and putting it into storage. And so you could say that China is consuming less foreign oil. That is true. But just because they're not burning it doesn't mean they don't want it, right? So
Right.
they've been taking advantage of the sale price.
Going back to something else you said, it's the shale revolution that's helped create this cushion of supply. So even as we read of late that the shale drillers or frackers are not getting in because the price per barrel isn't high enough to justify their cost, will that have a profound effect on supply over time? Will we see a big rebound, or you know what, it's not that much because supply everywhere is up?
Yeah. So when the president tweets drill baby drill for US producers, yeah, I mean the profit motive is not there for them, certainly not at $64 a barrel. And a lot of the cost right now, particularly in the Permian, about 20% of the cost of drilling a well is in the cost of steel for the piping. And so with tariffs on steel, the cost of production in the US has gone up and made it even less economical for our producers to increase production. So yeah, they're not excited about that. But at the same time, US production is at the highest it's ever been. We're producing like 21 million barrels a day. That's incredible. And it's really come online very, very quickly in like the last decade. So the question is it sustainable? How long will the US be the most important producer in the world of oil? Yeah, it won't be forever. And there are probably a lot of reasons for that. The geology, the investment environment, our policy environment. And if we were to put restrictions or a carbon tax, for example, that would change, the whole kind of scenario of what is, what makes sense. But we're a little bit away from that. It kind of depends on, what we think of as peak demand for oil globally and within our own economy. Maybe that's 5 years away, maybe it's 10 years away. There's a lot of debate and disagreement about that. It depends a lot on, basically our transportation sector and how we electrify all kinds of things. But the future of US shale right now is fine, but not necessarily growing, I would say, certainly at this price point. Now, what a lot of market participants and sort of the projections for price into the end of this year and into 2026 are still in this 60s range, 60s, low 70s range. And so that's for shale, 60 is really not great, 65 is fine, 70, everybody's basically happy. So they're very, very small margins for profitability.
Okay, that was really helpful. Let me go back to the Middle East. When people ask Beacon or people like me, what are the things that Iran might do to hit back at the United States or Israel? We say missile shots at bases and maybe their terrorist networks will come after us. But inevitably, someone says the Straits of Hormuz. The Iranians may shut the Straits of Hormuz, but we've sort of discounted that as a real possibility. Do you think we're wrong in that? Do you think that's a likely move by the Iranians? Wouldn't it be exceptionally disruptive to their own economy and to their neighbors who would be upset with them?
Well, it seems they opted clearly not to do that, right? I mean, the
Right.
retaliation that they chose was choreographed. I was first surprised that they chose Qatar, but then it made total sense because Qatar was the only GCC state that they had a good relationship with, that they could say, okay, we're going to do this, but you're not going to fire back. And the Qatar said, okay, fine. Bahrain maybe would have been a little different. Saudi would have been a little different, UAE, et cetera. So they chose a safe option at the end of the day. But had they escalated, if we get into some kind of future scenario where things start heating up again, yes, this is the threat that the Iranians make. If we can't export oil, nobody else can. But I think most, and I'm not a military expert by any means, but we have enough of a presence where if they did choose to harass ships in the strait, to use limpet mines again, or to try to blockade it completely, they would not be able to do it for very long. And so when you put that in sort of a risk premium per barrel, at the height of the last week or so, that's been about $12 a barrel, is looking at, if Iran closed the strait, what would that do to oil prices? And how much of a flow would be really impacted? Would it be 50%, 75%, et cetera? And then there's a lot of calculation around what that would do to oil price. But in most of those scenarios, it never really got above 110 dollars a barrel.
So they wouldn't do this lightly, and it may be only after that we had taken serious measures against them. So it's among the last buttons they would press to push back on everyone.
Or if Israel had targeted Iranian energy infrastructure, which they did not do, but if they had, then yes, Iran might choose that path. And that's what they threatened. But we're not in that scenario, and I think it's looking less and less likely.
So when we looked at the Iranian targets, nuclear, of course, top of the list, military, top of the list, and I think we're led to believe by some of the Israeli papers that they had mostly worked their way down those lists. I thought there were a couple of economic targets, nothing huge and gigantic, but among the first few strikes. Are you aware of any energy infrastructure that the Israelis hit? And if they did, or even if they didn't, would you view hitting these economic targets as part of a regime change strategy by the Iranians to make everyday Iranians feel more pressure on their pocketbook?
I don't think that would be a target of choice by the US or the Israelis. We do, neither wants the ordinary Iranian to be more encouraged to support the regime, right? We don't want this rallying around the flag effect to happen.
That could definitely happen. I was thinking more that the Israeli calculus might be, if your average Iranian is more frustrated with the government because energy prices are spiking, in part because of the nuclear program that they insisted on doing, that this is yet another reason to rise up against the regime. But I hear you. It could go either way.
Yeah. But no, I'm not aware of Israeli attacks on Iranian energy infrastructure. And in fact, the opposite is true. I think the only energy infrastructure we've seen attacked has been the refinery in Haifa.
Going back to, I think it was October, there was some discussion when the Iranians were scrapping with the Israelis that the Israelis might hit Karg Island. I'm not sure they actually came really close to doing that, but talk a little bit about Karg Island's importance. I think it's maybe fair to say it's the centerpiece of the export of oil industry in Iran. Talk a little bit about what that looks like and how it might be, what oil trade might be affected if it were to be blown up.
So Iran is producing about 3.5 million barrels a day and exporting about maybe 1.5, 1.7 million barrels a day. So it would affect the customers of those exported barrels, which is mostly China. And this, I think, interestingly, the president seems to have some attention to the Chinese appetite for Iranian oil. So that would be the victim, so to speak. Yeah, it's the center of their export. It's the center of refining, and it's also in a sort of a vulnerable position, right? Like being sort of exposed within the Gulf. So yeah, I don't think that's not where we landed in
Mm-hmm.
the last week or so, and I don't see that as certainly a first step on the any re-escalation ladder.
Gotcha. All right. I want to get to your views on how you see the Gulf Arabs and their view of everything as events have developed. But before we do that, it seems President Trump may not have maximum pressure in mind right now for the Iranians because he tweeted out something that I found puzzling, which was that the Iranians can seemingly now export oil with impunity to China. I think you probably saw that Truth Social as well. And what did you make of it? And did you find it as confusing maybe as I did?
Yeah, I do think it's confusing. Either does he not know that Iran already is selling oil to China? It has not been impeded. I don't know. I don't know if he means that some of the sanctions that are currently on Iran might be lifted. I mean, that it's just not clear. I don't know what he meant. And maybe it was a signal to China that it's some empathy with, their source of supply. I don't know. But that said, China imports oil from a lot of different places. They are well diversified in their oil import mix. So if they couldn't get it from Iran, they can get it from other places. It would be replaceable.
You're, of course, an expert on the region and energy flows in general, but let me ask you, how did you see the UAE and the other Gulf Arabs, the Saudis? How did they view the episode that we've been looking at over the last 12 days, especially as it pertains to energy?
I think this is the worst, the nightmare scenario when we saw missiles being intercepted over Doha. Lots of videos of people in malls in Doha running for cover. In Bahrain, they had advance warning to citizens not to, kids didn't go to school in Bahrain this week. Government workers were told to work from home. Kuwait had set up emergency shelters. We saw the cancellation of flights of British Airways, Singapore Airlines, and then absolute kind of standstill of air traffic for half a day. That is not part of the plan. And the plan, particularly in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, is about economic transformation, diversification, building out new sectors away from oil and gas, but also keeping those, as very, very important sources of government revenue. But you cannot have, on a postcard, pictures of missiles flying over and thinking, oh yeah, this is a great place to have the World Cup or the Asian Games or
Mm,
to build a new five-star resort or to relocate my family and take a job in a family office or to take a job, running a large infrastructure fund or private equity fund. All of those things in economies in Qatar, in the case of the UAE, in which only 10% of the population are citizens, and you're almost completely reliant on foreign labor and foreign expertise, that is not a selling point, right?
right.
And so I think, it even though it did not hurt anyone, and even if Saudi Arabia and the UAE were not targeted, this went to Al Udeid, the image is still very much of one Gulf. And the Arab Gulf states rallied around each other. There have been lots of past tensions within the GCC with the blockade of Qatar from 2017 to 2021. But immediately we saw statements of solidarity, of condemnation of Iran for targeting the Qatari airspace. And this is not what they want to see, both because it's what they see as a violation of sovereignty, but also just a threat to their business climate and the goals that they have for an image of stability and prosperity.
And that especially goes with what we always hear from Saudi Arabia, which is we're about diversification. We want to make progress on Vision 2030. we don't really want an Iranian-Israeli war anymore because it runs totally counter to this new image we're trying to promote, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's no love lost between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but since March 2023, we had the, brokered agreement, which was hosted in China, basically, uh, beginning again diplomatic relations and at least like lines of communication between members of government, foreign ministers, defense ministers of Iran and Saudi Arabia. And that's been really important. And that decision was the one that they made very carefully. And it was based on a sense of insecurity, a sense of focusing on the domestic economy and really trying to put, some of the tensions and problems of the region in the past. And frankly, out of a real fear that they did not want to see a repeat of the 2019 attacks on the Aramco facilities in Abqaiq and Khurais, which were launched from Iran. And the sense in 2019 was that the US didn't do much or seem to react much, and that was President Trump in their defense. I think at the time, President Trump said something like, no Americans were hurt. Basically, it's not our problem. And that's when we saw a real kind of pivot in their diplomatic outreach and relationship building with Iran. The same thing happened well, not the same thing, a similar thing happened in 2022 in the UAE when there were missiles and drones launched from Yemen by the Houthis into Abu Dhabi. And the Emiratis felt very much that the US, even though from Al Dhafra Air Base, we did help shoot down some of those, but that we didn't respond, at least in rhetoric or in leader to leader communication, with
Yeah.
enough seriousness or understanding of their threat perception. And my worry is that literally at this moment, the president's tweeting is basically like, yay, peace for everyone. But there's been pretty much zero acknowledgement of the way that Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, even Oman might have felt when those missiles were flying over, and what kind of assurances were given, were jets scrambled, and I'm sure that there was a lot going on militarily, but just communicating that in a sign of empathy and a sign of concern at the leader to leader level is really, really important in these relationships.
We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Dr. Karen Young.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
What is this state of the Iranian oil and gas industry? Could you just sort of comment on how's that industry doing within Iran? How much of their exports go to China? And are they otherwise efficient and profitable?
Yeah, I mean, I probably can't go too deep into that because we don't really know. It's quite opaque, right? I mean, could Iran produce more if it had more investment? Yeah, probably. Where is that going to come from? China certainly hasn't been they've been willing to buy the oil, but they haven't been willing to say, yes, we want to like really build up your oil industry. The gas industry has tremendous potential. They sit on the largest gas field that they share with Qatar in the world, but they've been really unable to turn that into an export product because they lack the technology and the terminals and the facilities to do so. If we were to achieve some sort of, magical change in Iran's kind of standing in the global community, if sanctions were erased, could that change? Yeah, potentially. There could be, inflows of investment, but it's not something that the Gulf states have been really itching to do. I mean, and as we started our conversation, it's not like we're short of oil.
Mm-hmm.
And even LNG right now, we're pretty well supplied. There's a lot of new supply coming online, including from the United States. So it's a little bit like they're late to the party for big infrastructure that takes a lot of money and a long time to build, there are probably other places that are better positioned and ready to meet demand should it surge.
Okay, gotcha. For U.S. companies looking to establish a presence in the Gulf, how should they interpret the security environment going forward?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, and it's probably the one that's going to take such a long time to heal and understand, and that's Israel's position, relationship, engagement, integration in the region. After the Abraham Accords, we had sort of a real hopefulness in terms of Gulf Israel, investment flows and people-to-people contact. And we're just not at that point right now. Israel feels very much that these threats have been existential. It's on a 24/7 war footing. And I don't think it's really going to come down from that for quite some time. So that means that the potential for a reignition of this kinetic attacks between Israel and Iran could happen again. If we get down the road, let's say the ceasefire holds, but there's a sense that there's, a break-off threat from members of the Revolutionary Guards who want to, take a more hardliner stance, a more aggressive stance, a more terrorist stance. Israel's not going to wait, right? They have clearly demonstrated that they are taking a preemptive strategy towards their neighbors, right? If they
Yeah.
perceive a risk, they are going to take it out early. And they've established that now. And so I think this is really difficult for the GCC states, which had, begun to be open to the idea of a more kind of integrated region with Israel, that they're a little nervous. Like, are you going to give us a phone call? Are we going to know in advance? Like, what does this have to do with, our own plans and the environment that we're trying to build and the perception of stability? So that's kind of the big question mark that I think is going to hang over the region and be with us for a while. And it certainly will hinder any kind of efforts of Saudi-Israeli normalization and even the normalization that's occurred already.
Well, those are great points because I think the administration is really putting out that this was one and done.
Yeah.
They want to demonstrate that you can have a military strike and it won't lead to a quote endless war and ground troops and fantasies of democracies across the Middle East. But the Israelis just might decide to go in again one day. And so as you rightly point to sort of business attitudes on the stability of the region, they have to keep that in mind.
Yeah. And, the I think the perception from the GCC states is, we still live here. Like America, that's nice. You're finished.
Right.
Again, you like, drop by and then exit, but we still live here. And they're not going anywhere and Iran's not going anywhere. So they have to have some kind of mode of, of operation of engagement. And that right now just looks really, really difficult.
I know you mentioned Iranian oil and sanctions, but let me just ask you, if the president were to go back to a maximum pressure sanctions campaign, is there anything that leaps out at you? I guess what I've heard the most is it wouldn't be as successful as it was in Trump's first term because so much more of it now goes to China. And unless we're
Yeah.
willing
China
to,
China is the deciding factor. So
and we may not be willing to secondarily sanction all of these companies that are Chinese. I don't know if President Trump has that on his to-do list.
or to chase down those tankers, the ones that are going to Malaysia and then reflagging their crude as Malaysian rather than Iranian. Are we going to, chase them down with our navy and no, we're not going to do that, right?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think so anyway.
And so the shadow fleet is especially important because it defeats what really hamstrung the Iranians last time, which was the United States going to insurance providers and others and saying, you just banks, correspondent banks, you just don't want to be involved in the Iranian oil business at
Yeah.
all because this is too risky. And so they've sort of defeated us with the dark fleet, huh?
Yeah, I mean, there's stories of Brian Hook calling up individual captains and saying, like, I know where
Yeah,
you are. Like, are you
right.
sure you want to take that cargo? Yeah, we're not enforcing certainly at the level that was in the first Trump administration. And that's because, yes, the carriers have changed and they're dangerous, frankly, right? These are not insured in the same way. These ships are often old and not in the best repair. We're risking, oil spills. We're risking, ecological damage, not just sanctions evasion.
Yeah, so it's a big contrast. Last time we went to the Japanese and the South Koreans and we said, please buy less Iranian oil. And over time they did. But this is China, and that's a whole different kettle of fish. How will this affect Saudi Arabia's investment program and giga projects?
Yeah, this is super important. So, when we think about oil revenue dependency in a fiscal balance, all of the GCC exporters are vulnerable, but some more than others. Like little Bahrain's break-even price is about $120 a barrel. We're not going to see that price anytime soon. Saudi Arabia, depends who you ask, but it's probably in the $90 a barrel range of their fiscal break even. So that means for planned spending, that's how much they need to be selling oil at in order to meet their expenses. So you have two ways you can deal with that. You can spend less, you can cut the budget, or you can borrow money. And right now, Saudi Arabia is doing both, right? They're issuing a lot of debt and they're cutting back on projects. So the project award cycle, which you can track very nicely and carefully at mead.com, which does a fantastic job of looking at these award cycles. It is, I don't know, it's like 20% of what it was last year, or even from 2023 was sort of the high point of these awards, basically big construction contracts. And so the government is saying like, okay, we're going to put that on ice for a little bit, or maybe it doesn't need to be as big as, the drawing and the first PowerPoint we saw of that plan. And I think some prioritizing is natural and should be what a government does anyway, but it will have to be, part of the way the government thinks about what's most important, what's most likely to create jobs, what's most likely to encourage foreign partnership and investment, and what's best for, thinking about the longer term and the future of the Saudi economy. So tourism projects have done pretty well, but they are, again, the most vulnerable to regional conflict and regional
Yeah,
instability. So
right,
they've been the fastest to kind of come to completion, or some of these Red Sea projects, these, kind of five-star developments that are super nice, but people don't want to spend $2,000 a night on a hotel room with missiles flying overhead, right? Or the threat
right.
of the Houthis, et cetera. We've seen a lot of good progress in sort of the entertainment space, and that's something that Saudi citizens are making use of. The kind of financial services sector in Saudi Arabia has been expanding. More and more people are getting mortgages, for example. So they've met a lot of those targets, more and more women entering the workforce, et cetera. So they've done really well on many, many things, but this is sort of a critical point. And oil at $64 a barrel. I mean, Aramco just, I think, announced today their share price was one of the lowest it's been in quite a while. The company is under pressure. And one of the ways that the Saudi government and the Public Investment Fund tried to sort of create more cash flow into the fund in order to pay for some of these large giga projects was basically to mandate that Aramco would have a larger dividend payout. And the PIF is a major owner of the company. And so you can't sustain that dividend payment when the share price is falling and the company is generating less in terms of their sales. So all of those are questions right now that the government will have to take very, very seriously and basically just take a red line to many planned expenditures.
So the majority of commercial marine traffic heading to Europe and North America continues to be routed around South Africa's Cape of Good Hope instead of going through the Red Sea route to the Suez Canal. Is this permanent? You mentioned the Houthis. What is
Yeah.
needed to reassure Red Sea shippers that the Red Sea is safe again?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those crazy things like the decoupling of oil price and regional conflict. The ease with which we've seen these workarounds in global shipping has been pretty phenomenal. And there are a couple reasons why. One is that fuel costs have been kind of low and that the availability of both ships and containers has been plentiful. And so we've seen this rerouting really happen, very extraordinary. I mean, poor Egypt is losing about $6 billion a year in fees from what it would have gained from ships transiting the Suez. So that just shows you, the spillover effects in the regional economies are pretty tough. But yeah, that's could the shipping industry keep doing what it's doing? Sort of depends on also insurance premiums. The Houthis have been relatively quiet of late. We have the truce still holding between the United States and the Houthis. My personal suspicion is that maybe Iran is not sending payment to the Houthis.
Hmm.
And they've, decided that they're going to calm down. I don't know. I mean, that's just a suspicion. But if you are a shipping company and you've got to make that choice and things are working kind of the way they are, I don't see big changes. There's no reason to do it immediately, especially with oil prices in the 60s.
Okay, so back to the market and oversupply generally. What do you make of OPEC's moves of late to increase production? With the US as a major producer now, is it safe to say that OPEC is becoming irrelevant?
So, this is the OPEC Plus agreement, and this is basically the rollback of cuts which have been happening over the past couple of years. And so, there were a couple of priorities, mainly led by Saudi Arabia's decision making within the group. Saudi Arabia had been bearing the brunt of these cuts. I think there was a decision basically to fight for market share and to also, in some ways, punish those who had been producing over their quota, and that's the UAE in some degrees, but also Iraq and Kazakhstan, more importantly.
Hmm.
And so that's been happening. Saudi Arabia exported and produced more this month than it has in a very, very long time. I think we're looking at over 9 million barrels a day. So that's good for them, even if prices are on the downward cycle, because they're getting more to market. And they want to be sure, and basically their long-term view is that, they have low cost of production, they have a cleaner product in terms of emissions, and that they can be in the market longer. And so they're going to fight for that. There's a lot of kind of tension points about, can the OPEC Plus group stay cohesive? What's the Saudi-Russia relationship? And even within the GCC states, there was talk, a year or so ago that the UAE might be considering exiting the group. That sort of died down now, but it is difficult to maintain discipline and cohesiveness, especially on these production quotas. But we will see that, Saudi Arabia, plays this role as kind of the disciplinarian, and, they want to maintain that, right, as kind
Hmm.
of a point of pride, and also of influence. The US, yes, is a competitor, but it's interesting when we think about these national oil companies, Aramco, ADNOC, for example. These are businesses that want to be across the energy sector. So ADNOC and Aramco are more and more getting into gas. They and their subsidiary or associated investment vehicles are buying up assets in the United States, particularly US LNG assets. So, these are diversified companies that want to dominate an energy sector, and that means oil, gas, potentially blue or green hydrogen, and also in the renewable space. So these, they have the sovereign investment vehicles to do so that are associated with or related to their oil companies.
Gotcha. All right. Really smart. All right. Two more questions. We're beginning to get to the end of the program. On Saudi Israeli normalization, is there a path forward there? I should say, I know it has a lot to do with Gaza, but on the economic front, is there a lot to gain there for Israel and Saudi Arabia, or is it more just symbolic and for security cooperation?
I think right now it's a non-starter. A year ago, or 2 years ago, it was very different. In terms of economic opportunity, I mean, one of the main reasons why the UAE, I believe, wanted to normalize with Israel was the opportunity to invest in Israeli gas, and to establish a pipeline or to use an existing pipeline, and to get a piece of that industry. They got what they wanted. They also wanted security and technology transfer. They wanted, potential expertise and human expertise coming to the UAE, and they got that too. For Saudi Arabia, yeah, I mean, I think in the security sector, in technology, it would be great. But look what just happened with the president's visit to the UAE and Saudi Arabia just, over a month ago. Basically, the Gulf states got agreements on technology transfer, particularly within artificial intelligence, that, in some ways surpasses what we do with Israel. So, it kind of leaves like, what do you need Israel for? You've got you've got
Right.
access to the US best technology and the companies that want to partner and be there. Now, that calculation, particularly in like the construction and use of data centers with US technology and US semiconductors in the Gulf, maybe now is looks a little different,
Yeah.
but the deals are made.
So when we talk about data centers in the Middle East, and it makes sense intuitively to everyone that there's an overabundance of energy in the Middle East, but literally, what are we talking about? Is it hooked up to natural gas
Mhm.
turbines? How are they going to power all of the data centers?
Yeah, so, in the UAE, about 72% of the electricity mix is natural gas. About 20% is nuclear, and the rest is renewable or solar. So, and they're getting more and more gas online. ADNOC is very, very focused on domestic gas production and buying up assets all over the world. But the nuclear power is certainly an asset in the UAE. The other thing is, they can just build a power plant, right? There's no permitting, there's no like land use question. Like you want to build a huge data center and connect it to a grid or have
Mm,
its own distinct power source, no problem, done. That takes years in the United States, right? So you can have the source of the electricity mix. It can be renewable, it can be, with battery power, it can be with nuclear. They'll figure it out. They can do it and they can do it very quickly. In the Saudi case, they don't have nuclear power. They would like to have. They're interested even in investing in perhaps like small modular reactors for this purpose, for building out data centers. But they're also increasing their gas production and massive build outs of solar power in the kingdom. So they'll be able to meet some of those needs too. But they have not announced projects on the scale in terms of megawatts of what it requires to power them that the UAE is very ambitiously trying to build.
Are there any other big long poles in the tent as we think through data centers in the Middle East? I've heard from some, or anecdotally, that they don't have enough water to cool all the data. Is that right? What else if we were
Yeah.
issue spotting on data centers in the Middle East, what else would be on
Well,
the
it's
list?
like the worst geographic place to put such a thing because of climate stress, because of heat stress. Yes, these places not just need electricity, they need cooling. And most of the cooling that happens in the region is used like district cooling through desalinated water.
Mhm.
So they don't use like heat pumps, like compressed air. They use water for cooling, which also has to be desalinated before you can run it through the pipes in a building. So that implies more energy demand, both for the desalination and then for, the operation in the plants. But, this is something that the Gulf states and their energy companies, including a company like Aqua Power, that's what they do. That's their business. They're really good at it. So, it's a problem that's solvable. But in terms of the sort of the most ideal place to build a giant data center is probably in like Iceland, where you're sitting on geothermal power and it never gets that hot.
Yeah.
That's the perfect place to build such a thing.
All right, I'm going to invest there. All right, so last question, and you've begun to touch on this already, but it's really just the contrast between the president going through the Middle East, talking about their economic future a month ago, and especially Qatar, and then contrast that with Iranian missiles flying into Qatar's airspace. How are they evaluating their big bet on Trump following all of this?
I mean, didn't Qatar take one for the team? I mean, really just incredible. And I suppose they will want a favor in return, both from Iran and from the Trump administration. I can't imagine otherwise. This is just tremendously damaging, I would think, to their, reputation as a safe place. So, it's wow. Yeah, that's
I would have guessed Iraq if I had been asked right before. I guess I would have thought they would have gone
Yes,
for the
right.
exact Qasem Soleimani play
Exactly.
and sent it into empty tents at
Yeah.
Al Assad Air Force Base.
Yeah.
Well, Karen, thank you so much. This has been incredibly insightful and on topic as we think through the implications of the Israeli-Iranian conflict. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank
We
you.
really appreciate it.
I appreciate you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. That was Dr. Karen Young. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please leave us a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.